And I should say there will be time for a Q&A after the lecture.
Now I have to be in range of several things. Sound and light, actually. Thank you very much for those lovely invitations. Yes, thank you very much for the invitation and also for the introductions. I'm very glad to be here. In hearing the recitation of the subject matter of the essays for this particular term, I feel I haven't actually touched on any of those things, but we will see. I've been, along with almost everyone I know, very concerned about our position in the world right now. The one that gets coordinates from the whole notion of the Anthropocene. I don't have to enumerate the catastrophes and tragedies that are going on all around us. I feel, although I think most people do at any moment in history, that the scale is really unprecedented, and everything that we are working on in any field of endeavor needs in some way to be in light of the possibility of making a contribution to turning down the pressure, the volume, the stress on all of the systems, from our internal nervous systems to all of the planetary biosphere. So I began with the idea of looking at the Anthropocene as a poet who does experimental work and whose interests are not exclusively, but are very much involved with experimental work in all of the arts, and wanting to think about precedents in the arts that in concerted ways were attempts to deal with similarly, I don't want to say catastrophic yet, but similarly under the or in the specter of possible apocalypse. I thought of looking at Dada as a response to what went on pre and post World War I in Europe, and then turning to forms of experiment now, which are, I think, very different in many ways, though almost all of them have roots in the modernist avant-garde. Hence my title, which sprouted a subtitle at some point: Avant-Garde in the Anthropocene, Manifestos and Wagers. As I began this essay, which is actually the beginning of a longer project, I did it out of interest in artist responses to extreme instances of unsettled times, choosing the pre- and post-World War I period in Europe where modernism somehow squeaked out of the wild disarray, elegantly rational, cool, sleek, playfully and darkly ironic, and then again, in hindsight, much of it, none of these things, blunt, brutal, racist, entrepreneurial, commodity obsessed. In what follows, I'll be sampling some of the language from a few of the many manifestos that studded the modernist terrain. I'll also compare its avant-garde ethos with American experimentalism at the very end. But first, a clarification of the terms of my title as I'm deploying them for this purpose. I'm thinking of the avant-garde as it first entered Euro-American vocabularies, from the French, of course, in a military context, denoting those leading the way in the forefront of battle. It migrated into early 20th century culture wars, a widespread scene of socio-political turbulence, not unlike our present situation in its violence, class divides, and uncertainties, some of which led to the 1905 and 1917 revolutions in Russia, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the unprecedented in savagery, then unprecedented, I should say, in savagery and death toll catastrophe of World War I. The post-war milieu spawned what would soon be called modernism, artists who were introducing new perspectives, or trying to, on long-held assumptions about the nature and purpose of art, saw themselves as an avant-garde in the vanguard of combating the entrenched aversion to radical change of a discredited bourgeois culture. In many cases, they mimicked advances in industrial and commodity design and also in the technology of warfare, particularly the breakthroughs in power and speed. They wanted, with their art, to propel society toward radically new horizons, new realities, entirely reconceived futures. Action, art, argument were to be inseparable. Every movement had its manifesto. The word Anthropocene is currently the candidate for naming a new geological epoch, cutting short the roughly 12 millennia run of the Holocene, which is still our current epoch. Prior epochs have lasted millions, not mere thousands of years. Our cozy Holocene became widely habitable for large mammals and the abundance of other life forms that we've taken for granted for a very long time, seemingly, after the retreat of the last ice age glaciers from most of the planet. That retreat, a self-organizing process of the biosphere. The word Anthropocene comes from the Greek anthropos, meaning man, and which is now supposedly meaning human, but I think mostly still means man, and scene, spelled C-E-N-E, which means new. It's the suffix tagged onto every epoch, going backwards, Holocene, Pleistocene, Pliocene, etc. Scene, C-E-N-E, is the linguistic shifter for radical geological change. The word Anthropocene entered scientific vocabularies when it was coined by geologic stratigraphers in the 1980s in order to denote the time interval during which humans have profoundly affected Earth's biosphere. altering dynamic systems, disturbing ecological equilibriums, and, of course, most dramatically, affecting long-standing patterns of the climate. There is much debate over when, if this is indeed the heralding of a new epoch, just when it began. I'm taking the Anthropocene to denote the scene spelled S-C-E-N-E of the human enterprise writ large as recording history begins. Anthropos composing the story of the world. As language instruments, both avant-garde and Anthropocene, in their respectively long and short currency, have dramatically heightened attention to the material relation of history to possible futures. It is, after all, the grammar of the future tense that has been a crucial instrument for speech acts and projections of the imagination that involve promise, hope, and optimism in the direst of times. But the commonplace constructions we so readily use to invoke the sense that there will be more to life than this raise some pragmatic questions about the invocation of futurity itself. Is it not a fundamental alterity, the future, existing only as a hypothetical? Altruistic values, logically, on which altruistic values, ethical, moral, and even hedonistic, logically depend. Actually, I'm going to reread that sentence. I tried to catch up with it after I had skipped some of it. So, the future as a fundamental alterity, existing only as a hypothetical in a dubiously stable, imaginative dimension on which ethical, moral, hedonistic, altruistic values logically depend. There is also the matter of degrees of control that we can actually count on. What can and cannot be predicted, what can and cannot be prescribed. In other words, everything having to do with our meticulously, desperately neat grammars of past, present, and future is in the world outside the book, shot through with contingency. If we are to take physics, chaos theory, aka complex system dynamics, evolution, genetics, and ecosystem biology seriously, it's not surprising that instabilities in what seem to be infinite configurations plague us, stimulate us, terrify us. Hence, the playfully serious relevance of the wager, or as one definition of optimism has it, the willingness to construct attempts that may lead to being pleasantly surprised. Current climate change disasters desperately threaten species on every scale, the scenes of crushed humanity in the ruins of what had been enduring civilizations, millions of displaced, the continuing brutality toward women and people of color, now accompanied in some of our minds by specters of full-out apocalypse, gives sobering resonance to the word Anthropocene, a different kind of renaissance. The first ethically inflected name for a geologic timestamp. It must raise our self-consciousness as species to a new scale. I would like to temporarily, therefore, restore the S to the word anthropos, man in Anthropocene. I've written elsewhere, as have others, historical gender implications in the Earth's degradation are everywhere. In letristic terms, that S not only renders man etymologically complete and present, it spreads the Anthropocene further out along the alphabet as horizon of our poetics, a poetics that has since the ancient Greek tragedies in which anthropos figured so prominently, of the projected, figured so prominently in projected scenes of pity and terror, beauty and devastation, those still trenchant cliches that, if we can continue to hear them, are reminders of how we who love so spectacularly, our species does that, love, are the same we who, as Robert Smithson put it, are ingenious at creating ruins in reverse. At this point, I of course think of the giant toddler building his towers into the skyline ruins, even as they rise, blotting out of more and more light, more and more into a ruined sky, a blotted horizon, monuments of ruin to the death of what used to be called, without hesitation, nature. That S is necessary to locate Anthropocenes of the crime. Something I didn't say to begin with, as a kind of warning, is that I have been experimenting with having a kind of dialogue of poetry and prose, so to speak, alternating in essays that I've been writing, and that's happening in this one as well. So here it comes. Here comes the first instance. Anthropocenes, Anthropocenery, Anthropocenities. A storm is slanted toward the trailer park. No immigrant ripple, pith, inescapable. The class of all thoughts that can't entertain themselves upend would-be transcendence lurking here. Shine, Baukna, beacon. No ship won't go down in that Gesamtkunst stormy sea. Bacon sizzles on the nonstick pan. What is mean or meant in this? Who cares to know? One dimension grinds noisily by another in a routine demonstration. Proper response: enjoy the friction, avoid the collision. Beautiful silver fish jumps out of water and explodes in air. Trans-nipple Q. Will some of us never be post-data? Long days, nights are hot, cold, violent, obscene, too wet, too dry for too many on this planet. I'm too dry to be on this planet. Will some of us never be post-data? I hope so. Should some of us be post-data? Should any of us ever be post-data? What does or would it mean to be post-data? To strike a kind of conceptual tuning fork at this point, I offer a two-part aphorism from the anomalous Jean Retallack. Humor without gravitas passes through the mind with little effect. Gravitas without humor is death. The playful aspects of Dada have always appealed to me. Most of my impressions of that spirit have come from the visual art associated with it and from the work, both visual and linguistic, of Kurt Schwitters, whose emphasis on the fundamentally letristic basis of the composition in poetry has been important in my own work. For purposes of thinking about avant-garde in the Anthropocene, with and without its restoration-esque, I thought I'd look at a range of responses to a period of brutally violent times in the work of Hugo Ball and Tristan Tzara. Although I must note that both created their best-known Dada literature in the relative calm of the neutral Zurich in Switzerland. Even as the map of Europe all around it was being torn to shreds and patched back in newly contested configurations, the spectrum of Dada goes from the humorous to the grave to work seemingly deranged by the violence of the historical context, frenzied, hysterical, mean, filled with implicit scorn for women and non-intellectuals. Explicit scorn for women comes with the futurists. Here are some excerpts from Hugo Ball's playfully word-centered 1916 Dada Manifesto. In fact, the very first manifesto of the Dada movement, performed at a Zurich soiree on July 14th, Bastille Day. And many people don't know that Hugo Ball actually composed the first Dada manifesto. Tzara is much more famous for actually a much later manifesto. So I think of Hugo Ball as sort of the feminine actor in all of this. He gets brushed aside. Actually, he takes himself out of the scene, also traditionally feminine, but no more. So here's Hugo Ball. Dada is a new tendency in art. One can tell this from the fact that until now, nobody knew anything about it. And tomorrow, everyone in Zurich will be talking about it. Dada comes from the dictionary. It is terribly simple. In French, it means hobby horse. In German, it means goodbye. Get off my back. Be seeing you sometime. In Romanian, it means, yes, indeed, you are right, that's it, but yes, of course, definitely right, yes, yes, and so forth. An international word, just a word, and the word a movement. Very easy to understand, quite terribly simple. To make of it an artistic tendency must mean that one is anticipating complications. Dada psychology, Dada Germany cum indigestion, and Fox paroxysm, Dada literature, Dada bourgeoisie, and yourselves, honored poets, who are always writing with words but never writing the word itself, who are always writing around the actual point. Dada, world war without end. Dada, revolution without beginning. Dada, you friends and also poets, esteemed sirs, manufacturers and evangelists. Dada, Tzara, Dada, Hulsenbeck, Dada, Medada, Dada, Medada, Dada, Dada, dear Dada, Dada, Hugh, Dada, Tsa. And skipping quite a bit. I want the word where it ends and begins. Dada is the heart of words. Skipping the rest. Actually, not a lot more. It was a relatively short manifesto for the times. 6 months after performing his manifesto, Hugo Ball left Zurich for Paris, reportedly disgusted with the posturing and competitiveness of the man whose name became synonymous with Dada, Tristan Tzara. Tzara's competitive spirit led him to minimize the role Ball had played in the formation of the Dada sensibility. Here are some passages from Tzara's first manifest, written and performed 2 years later, also in Zurich in 1918. As you will hear, there is a vast temperamental and aesthetic range in what Tzara was writing. Here are 2 examples of Tzara's that I feel I learn something from. A painting is the art of making 2 lines, which have been geometrically observed to be parallel, meet on a canvas before our eyes in the reality of a world that has been transposed according to new conditions and possibilities. And then another snippet. Dada, the abolition of prophets. Dada, the abolition of the future. Dada, the absolute and indisputable belief in every God that is an immediate product of spontaneity. Dada, the elegant and unprejudiced leap from one harmony to another sphere. The trajectory of a word, a cry, thrown into the air like an acoustic disc. Liberty, Dada, 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 the roar of contorted pains, the interweaving of contraries and of all contradictions, freaks and irrelevancies. Life. 2 more excerpts from Modernism and Anthology of Sources and Documents are preceded by this editor's bio note. Romanian-born French poet, artist, avant-garde terrorist, and revolutionary. Here's some of that, again from the 1918 manifesto. I assure you, there is no beginning, and we are not afraid. We aren't sentimental. We are like a raging wind that rips up the clothes of clouds and prayers. We are preparing the great spectacle of disaster, conflagration, and decomposition, preparing to put an end to mourning and to replace tears by sirens spreading from one continent to another, clarions of intense joy bereft of that poisonous sadness. Dada is the mark of abstraction. Publicity and business are also poetic elements. Tzara seems to have had, if not a business model, an entrepreneurial gift for building and disseminating his own reputation. And not far down in that same section is this: every man must shout, there is great destructive, negative work to be done, to sweep, to clean. The cleanliness of the individual materializes after we've gone through folly, the aggressive, complete folly of a world left in the hands of bandits who have demolished and destroyed the centuries. Very good description of where we are right now. No? It turns out that the aggressive folly of the bandits does not require self-sacrifice or acts of courage. Those who are strong in word or in strength will survive because they are quick to defend themselves. The agility of their limbs and feelings flames on their faceted flanks. Morals have given rise to charity and pity. And this is where Zara really warms up, the faceted flanks, the rise to charity and pity, which are two dumplings that have grown like elephants, planets, which people call good. There is nothing good about them. Goodness is lucid, clear, and resolute, and ruthless toward compromise and politics. A poetic interlude as quasi-repast. Fierce love story. To start with a taxonomic impediment, and yet go on, looking always for news of another kind. Great saturated patches of color stall in their rumble toward the horizon. Squeezed tube dearth overflows with biblical pornography. No greater love, they had said. Sit back and watch in awe as one sophisticated critter eviscerates another on a color-coded screen. Much too bright or not enough to be convincing descriptions of nature. For the disillusioned, there are these three things. 1, sonorous cowboys hitch up their primate dungarees. 2, to restore the consolation of silence will remain the role of objects. 3, 4 little girls, along with fragile creatures of other kinds, may wander in and out of this color field just beyond our grasp. Before leaving Zara behind, I'll bet you're ready for that. Let's consider his best-known contribution to the future of poetry, his 1920 recipe for a Dadaist poem containing the famous assurance, "The poem will resemble you." To make a Dadaist poem, take a newspaper, take some scissors, choose from this paper an article of the length you want to make your poem, cut out the article, next carefully cut out each of the words that makes up this article, and put them all in a bag. Shake gently. Next, take out each cutting, one after the other. Copy conscientiously in the order in which they left the bag. The poem will resemble you. But that line is not actually the capping line. Zara goes on to say, "And there you are, an infinitely original author of charming sensibility, even though unappreciated by the vulgar herd." Ah, that vulgar herd, those working louts and many other classes beneath charity or pity dumplings of the enduring, arrogant male genius, remain intact as objects of scorn. We'll note a lot more of that in a brief fling with Marinetti in a few minutes. But it also happens that the cut-up contributed to an unintended revolution of its own in poetics, that of procedural compositions. Of course, it matters which newspaper you choose and which article. Those choices already determine the fact that the poem will resemble you. It will, albeit disjunctively enigmatically for your auditor or reader, vulgar or not. Reflect your interests, some sorts of things you care about. If you intentionally choose a newspaper and an article you don't care about, it will reflect that too. And because making sense and meaning of a poem is a collaboration with an attentive listener or reader, it will also reflect the interests and preoccupations of an engaged audience. Sarah doesn't seem to know that. He's still in the world of author reputation and intentionality, underwriting the whole shebang. But making meaning is always full of contingencies, even when you don't throw the words into a bag or a dapper Dadaist hat. Most interestingly, cut-ups and many other procedures incorporate chance moves radically diverting your habitual thought processes and thereby create circumstances in which the poem will not so much resemble as, or I should say, not as importantly resemble, as exceed you. Your self-conscious ego, your favorite stock of assumptions, your shtick, your default turns of phrase, your defiantly held biases are no longer fully determining the outcome. If you have constructed an astutely intelligent procedure, a form of AI driven not by technology, but curiosity to find what lurks outside habitual geometries of attention, there will be edifying surprises. That's almost guaranteed. All this is importantly serious play of the kind that synergistically activates imagination and intellect. Something in the crazy quilt of Sarah's Dada came up with a prototype that does in principle, if not in fact, lead to infinite numbers of combinatoric procedures. Dada remains rightly associated with that productive playfulness. It's inspired countless forms in which the gravitas to humor ratios can be stunningly apt in medias res of our extreme sport of everyday life. A lot of procedural work, including that of Oulipo, has benefited from this source by way of the many possible variations on it. Always somewhat improbably, procedures can generate work with great soul. That is one of its most enduring puzzles. I think of Juliana Spahr's beautiful, stunning, eco-poetic work, Things of Each Possible Relation, hashing against one another. And I will actually read something from that. Where are we in the time scheme of things? Well, in medias res, in what relation to the finish line? Okay, I'm going to, I'm going to do what I just said I was going to do. Juliana Spahr is a wonderful American poet who has been a major presence in developing eco-poetics as an important new presence insofar as it does, in fact, change our geometries of attention in relation to nature and nature poetry. Juliana wrote a long poem that actually got published as a small book called Things of Each Possible Relation, Hashing Against One Another. I bought 500 copies of this book when I was directing the language and thinking program at Bard, so that every incoming first-year student would have it and could work on it in the language and thinking programs that summer. And actually, we used them for many summers after that. And I think you may get a sense of why I did that when you hear, beginning with her preface, which is not a manifesto, but has some of its facets. Shortly, so she's talking about how she came to write the poem. Shortly after I moved to Hawaii, I began to loudly and hubristically proclaim whenever I could that nature poetry was immoral. There is a lot of nature poetry about Hawaii. Much of it is written by those who vacation here, and it is often full of errors. Rob Wilson calls these poems the 747 poems. These poems often show up in the New Yorker or various other establishment journals. But I was more suspicious of nature poetry because even when it got the birds and the plants and the animals right, it tended to show the beautiful bird, but not so often the bulldozer off to the side that was destroying the bird's habitat. Then skipping down. So during the summer of 2001, I took an ethnobotany course in order to learn the connections. I took an ethnobotany course because I was trying to be a better poet. I was trying to learn more about the world, and the world around me was so rich with plants and animals and birds, and yet so many of them were dying at such unprecedented rates. Hawaii has the highest rate of species extinction and endangerment in the United States. I was trying to think more about nature poetry, the juxtaposition between the great beauty of Hawaii and its ecological catastrophe remains emotionally confusing to me. I can't reconcile the coolness of the breeze and the sweet smells from the flowers and the beauty of the cliffs and the ocean with the large amount of death that is happening. And I was also thinking at the time about how poets need to know the names of things. And I didn't really know the names of lots of things that grew in Hawaii. I wrote the first drafts of many of these poems during class lectures in Ethnobotany 101. After I wrote first drafts, I put the drafts through, and here comes the procedural technique that she used. I put the drafts through the Alta Vista translation machine, very current then. Many of you haven't heard of it, but you would put it through Google Translate now. And translated my English words between the languages that came to the Pacific from somewhere else. So she's not just translating them into any languages. These are the languages of people who were moving to and from the Pacific and affecting the the ecosystem of Hawaii. Those languages were French, Spanish, German, and Portuguese. The translation machine is, of course, full of flaws and offers back some sort of language that only alludes to sense because it is so connected with another language. I like this about it. Then, after I had a number of different versions of the same poem, I sat down and wove them together. I wanted to weave them into complicated, unrecognizable patterns. I took the patterns from the math that shows up in the plants I was studying, or I tried to approximate the shapes of things I saw around me. So now I'll read the opening section of this, and the interweaving linguistically that happened because of these methods that she used resulted in an interweaving that is a kind of an ecosystem of the poem itself. The view from the sea, the constant motion of claiming, collecting, changing, and taking, the calmness of bays and the greenness of land caused by the freshness of things growing into the arrival to someplace else, the arrival to someplace differently, the freshness of the things increasing, the greenness of the ground, the calmness of the compartments, the constant movement to claim, to gather, to change, and to consider, see the arrival to someplace differently, constraint, constant motion. The green of the soil, which increases the freshness of things, then calmness and the sail, the requirement on meeting to modify and to regard the inbound of this someplace differently, the constant movement, the green of the ground that magnifies the coolness of the things, the calmness and the sail, the cause, the modifies, and the sea stops considering. The requirement in the meeting, the entrance with this someplace differently, things in constant movement, and from the green of the earth, which it magnifies for coolness, considering the calmness, and from ventilation, and the sea is modified, the requirements of this meeting, that this is someplace differently, the input of information, the coolness of things in constant movement, and the green of the track. From this calmness is the breath and the ventilation. The sea is modified and urges considerations. And then the conditions in the cause of meeting, the input of information, that this is someplace differently. Then the coolness and the things in constant motion. To this calmness, there is the breath and the green of the land. The sea expands and is modified by considerations. I pause so that you can breathe some of that in. Also so that I can breathe and drink. So that's I think one of the great pieces of work that is engaging with questions of the Anthropocene, and she actually wrote that, started the whole project before Anthropocene was sort of lit up on the marquee of all our minds. There are lots of others that could be mentioned. I'll just mention one more, and that's Nurbeze Phillips' Zong. Its creation of the middle passage on the page, the floating of words that created the slave trade page after page. It's an extraordinary procedural work, which again makes the thing happen, that rather than describing it or just talking about it. In the early 90s, I used a procedure that I intended to be an experiment to try to give a poem AIDS, HIV/AIDS, because I had been invited to give or contribute a poem in remembrance of someone who had died of AIDS, and someone close to the poetry community that I was part of. And I was able to do it actually letristically by starting out with the letters AIDS as the contaminating letters, the letters with the virus, and then moving those letters through the alphabet, through their proximity in the alphabet, to spread the contagion to an opening stanza that I had written of language that I cared deeply about, language that I didn't want to lose. That was the first principle of making that first choice. By the end of that procedure, the very last letter left was Y. So it was just a series of Y, and then finally nothing. That procedure was something that exceeded my abilities as an intuitive writer. So it's things like these that I think we have to keep doing. And now I will do another interlude that actually is less procedural, about experiments. The long and short of it, thought experiment. Feed long and short-beaked pigeons the same food. Exercise long and short-legged quadrupeds in the same manner. Expose long and short-haired sheep to the same climate. Direct every timeline toward the same set of nesting horizons. How long can the we and the they go on this way? One step takes longer than anyone thought possible and is still hovering in the air. Its shadow is swelling with prophecy and indecision. Earth is growing hotter and colder, wetter and drier. All the animals are on the move. Although the heart of the cruelty continues to elude our metrics, let any long or short lifespan equal exactly the same function of X divided by the violence of 0. The math is adding up to an old geometry of the tragic spectrum. More the terror, less the pity. Is that the long and short of it? So I am going to end with, do I want to do this or not? What time is it? Could we stop here for conversation, questions? Somehow I don't want to move to futurism now. I'd rather leave things just where they are, I think. Let me just check and see if there's anything I think worthy of going on. No, there's not. Not now. I'll go on with it in the continuation of the essay that I'm writing. A look at the grammar of Marinetti. I was actually thinking about Gertrude Stein's belief that of most interest in the world is history and grammar. And finally, I think toward the end, she would have added gender. That's certainly apparent in the last major work that she wrote, The Mother of Us All, the opera libretto based on the life and work of Susan B. Anthony. So where I would be going next, will be going in the writing that you don't have to be subjected to now, is history, grammar, gender in the futurist movement, and then on to Black Dada, which is a saving grace of Dada, if Dada needed one. I don't know whether to call it a movement or not, but it's a conceptual and a performative and material framework for poetical work that has to do with race in our time, but also with the stretching of imagination and the movement of our geometries of attention. And it's the work of Adam Pendleton, based on an expression he got from Amiri Baraka. So quite a legacy going back beyond that. So I would love now to move to the Q&A, particularly the Q.